Thank you. At the Ethical Society, we organize our programming year around a theme, and this year's theme is exploring the human condition. I hope you've enjoyed the diverse platforms that we've offered the past few months. We've been hard at work, scheduling dynamic speakers with fascinating topics for all of us in the coming months as well. Our speaker today is an educator, social worker, and leading voice on what we need to thrive now and in the future. She is the best-selling author of Whole Child, Whole Life, 10 Ways to Help Kids Live, Learn, and Thrive, and Making It What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World. Please welcome Stephanie Malia Krause.
Good morning, everybody. Brevity may be a leadership skill, but it's a learned skill also. So I'm going to set a timer for myself. Set. I'm going to put this over here and get myself situated. It's so wonderful to gather with you this morning. As Samantha mentioned, my name is Stephanie Malia Krause. I'm grateful to be in a space where folks also share their pronouns. Mine are she, her, hers. And I have a warm heart and very cold toes this morning. And want to say hello to everybody who's joining also virtually. If left to my own devices like Amy, I probably would be bundled in a number of blankets still in my house. And so you are the brave ones, those of you who ventured out today. And I hope that what I have to share can build on actually what Clark shared. It was a wonderful sort of introduction to so much of what we will be talking about this morning. So to get started, I should first tell you that I am Native Hawaiian and Jewish. I'm a Jewian. And but what it means for this morning is I use my hands a lot. So at some point, inevitably, I'm going to flick this microphone. But I want to tell you how I spent my past week. So over here, this is a picture of a part of my family. You see 3 generations of strong Hawaiian women here. And my grandmother, who is nearing 90, still living, is who I spent my past week with. It was actually a very difficult time. So let me just share what happened in November. My grandmother has been aging beautifully. She is well on her way to being what the Blue Zones have talked about. She is strong, living in her home, has been benefiting from pretty good health. And right before Thanksgiving, she had a health crisis. She ended up in the hospital, and while she was in the hospital, her house flooded. She got home and she had to be moved from her home. For the first time in her life, she was on a walker, her mobility significantly impacted by the injury that she had experienced. And she found herself in a hotel in the middle of the holiday season. And for all kinds of reasons, some of them family dysfunction and some of them true conflicts of scheduling, I was the first of her blood to get to her, but not until last week. When I arrived, my otherwise vibrant grandmother had seemed to have shriveled in on herself. I was so struck that even though I was supposed to leave last Wednesday, I immediately extended within 3 hours my trip to leave until Saturday, and then booked another trip to come back next month and again in April. I couldn't believe this shadow of a person who was my grandmother. And in the conversations the first night, I told my husband we stayed up until 3 a.m. She was nothing more than her crisis. She was in deep trauma, and her community had not shown up for her in the ways that I would have hoped they would. Not only that, my Native Hawaiian grandmother, for the first time ever, was disconnected from her culture and her community. That sense of belonging and purpose had been ripped from her. People who she thought would have shown up had not. And what was incredible to me was that it only took 2 days for her to come back into herself, to witness an absolute, total transformation of body, mind, and spirit, for her to be with me, to get the construction going, to get the doctor's appointments happening, to have somebody who she could connect with, to have a place where she belonged with her family, to have support in reconnecting with everyone who she was dear to, who it was just too hard to be in touch with. And what I could not stop thinking about in the couple of days that I was with her was, if you remember, during the pandemic, we have been so concerned about whether the earth and the climate can heal. Can we make it in time for our kids? I'm a mom of 2. And if you remember, when we all went home and we left the earth alone to heal, climate scientists and others marveled at how fast the healing really started to happen. And that's what I saw with my grandmother. It didn't take a lot of time to bring her back from the brink of something that was truly devastating. And what would be important was, before I left this past week, could there be supports and structures that would help once that initial push forward had happened? And as I was on the plane coming home, I kept thinking about the work that I do and the writing that I do. So as Samantha mentioned, this past summer, I wrote a book called Whole Child, Whole Life. And there will be copies at the back, but it's about kids. It's about the science of what young people need to thrive in a very volatile and uncertain world. But the marvelous thing that happened when I was writing Whole Child, Whole Life was that I realized what I saw with my grandmother, which is that what is good for kids is also good for us. So in case you cannot see the screen from your computer or it's difficult, I'm going to pull a former 5th grade teacher and I'm going to read to you. What is good for kids is often good for us. Their needs speak to the deepest parts of ourselves, echoing our own desires for love, care, understanding, patience, connection, novelty, and opportunity. We too want to belong and have community to turn to. We yearn to know where we come from and why we are the way we are. We need ways to heal and have a healthy life. We also seek to serve and see the world in all its splendor. And so for the next 15 minutes, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the science behind not only what my grandmother needs in elderhood, but what my mother and I need in adulthood, and what my children, Justice and Harrison, need in childhood. That at every age and stage of life, there are things that we need that make us most human, and that our most humane and holistic response in supporting each other as individuals and the collective is to call each other to live into a core set of practices that support the whole life. So let's go ahead and look at what those are. Oh, well, thank you. Sure. Okay, 5th grade teacher again. We'll go pre-K teacher. I was that too. What is good for kids is often good for us. Their needs speak to the deepest parts of ourselves. Okay, there we go. Echoing our own desires for love, care, understanding, patience, connection, novelty, and opportunity. We too want to belong and have community to turn to. We yearn to know where we come from and why we are the way we are. We need ways to heal and have a healthy life. We also seek to serve and see the world in all of its splendor. So there are these 10 practices that are supported by the science of thriving and flourishing, human development, the science of learning and longevity. And what's so powerful is that for those of us responsible for the care of kids, our job is to practice this for them. And for those of us who are in adulthood and elderhood, our job is to practice these ourselves and to advocate and work toward the kind of social change that supports those who are struggling with them. So the first set of practices, if we think about mindful breathing, think about this as the breath work of well-being. So the first big inhale are the foundational core practices that make us human, that make us live. So we'll talk about aliveness, and we'll talk about what it takes to love your life. But this first part, this first set, is about how we live our life. The first, of course, being, are our basic needs met? When I got to my grandmother, she wasn't sleeping well, she wasn't eating well, her housing had been disrupted. There were some core basic needs that needed to be met. Amazingly, purpose is also a basic need, and so is novelty. We need spark in our life, and we need meaning in our life. If you have kids, there are two basic needs for young people that are good for us, but necessary for them: play and rest, both of which do not happen enough for today's generation. The second is prioritizing our mental health. The importance here is that with the life that we are living, in the world we are living in, it is not a matter of if we will be challenged with our mental health, but when. And what will we need when that happens? And so learning emotional hygiene and self-care strategies is key. For those of you who really love the science, they used to think that we had a body-brain barrier and that, the mind and the brain were somehow separate from the body. But we now know that barrier is way more perforated than folks thought it used to be. There's deep connection with the nervous system and with what's happening if you have infections or illness. Really, mental health is health, and the reverse. And then back to novelty, investing in personal interests. We have to have that meaning, little m meaning and big M meaning in our life in order to be alive in the world. So this first breath is how we learned to set the foundation of what it means to be human. The second is that we are a social species. Sometimes I go backwards, and so if I do, just throw your hands up and be like, I think you're on the wrong slide. There are 3 practices that support thriving across the lifetime that deal with the fact that we are meant to be with people. The science is pretty clear that these social practices might actually be the most important. And based on what I saw with my grandmother last week, I would argue that that's probably correct. Our need to belong, to be in relationship, our need to be seen and welcome and known is a part of how we stay alive. Most of you have probably heard of the fight or flight response that happens when we're at risk, when we're being threatened. But far fewer of you will have heard, at least I had not heard, about another response that's wired into us, our sort of most primitive selves, which is tend and befriend. Because way back in ancient times, if you were alone as a human, no way could you stand up to all of the big threats that surrounded you, the animals, the elements, everything. And so wired into our DNA is the need to be with people. And we know that that varies. But what I heard from my grandmother, who, as I mentioned, is Native Hawaiian, is she has never felt more brown, more old, more alone than she did in this moment of intense vulnerability. Everything was heightened. We have to feel as though there is representation in what we seek ourselves and what we create as communities and congregations. This is the big exhale of the breathwork of well-being. And the next part, inhaling again, is time. We are meeting in a moment on a timeline where there was life before and life after. And the kids have gone, so I can say all of us have lived some life. And we know that the past continues to come up in the present in ways that are not only our own lived experience, but the lived experience of our parents and our grandparents and their parents. Generationally, there's an intense mapping that happens on our bodies. I wish I had more time. I would go into the emerging science on that. But what I will tell you is that our ability to attend as things from the past come up is critical to our well-being now and in the future. And then to what we heard this morning, which is that science now shows, so I'm thinking about this, attend to a 100-year mindset, that most of us, if we have access to the right resources and opportunities, can live to be 100 or longer. It's no longer an exception, it's an expectation. It's just advances in science and technology and healthcare. Again, very much tied to access to the right resources and opportunities. And so there is this question of what is it? What does it take to live a life? What does it take to live a long life? And what does it take to love that life? Now, as a mother, looking at my children, I don't want them to just live a life. I want them to love their lives. And so attending to what will support them not only now, but in the decades to come is a key part of how I, as a parent, support their well-being. But knowing now that I could have the possibility of how many more decades of living, there are questions on how I care for my own body and mind and spirit. So the final exhale here is what you're doing today. Service and spirituality. We're wired for it as much as we are wired for purpose and novelty and belonging. Because in life, we are asked to explore the answers to three key questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? And am I a part of something bigger? And those are the three core questions that make us not only live our lives, but be alive in our lives. And believing that we have a sense of self, that we have a sense of community, that we have a sense of purpose, that is what enables us to love our lives. And service and spirituality are tied, and they do not have to exist with religion, but we are wired for them. There is a natural bent to look for the beauty in the world, to protect and to defend. Importantly, service is the only practice that, in the absence of the others, makes well-being worse. Here's why. The problems of the world are big, and they can break you. And if you pursue change in the absence of supporting your own health and basic needs, not having others, and you take on racism and violence and bigotry and prejudice and these big historic things, they will defeat you. And yet, service can be the most powerful, transcendental practice, because when we pursue social change in the presence of health and community and belonging and purpose, It's like a deep accelerator for all of the rest. So as let's see, how am I doing here? 1 minute and 10 seconds, we're perfect, okay? So what then does thriving look like when it happens? Here's what the science shows across the lifespan, that it is a state of being that we go in and out of depending on our environment and our experience. I used to think that you can't survive and thrive at once. And what I now know is we must, that we are living in a time where we have to survive and we can thrive at the same time when the conditions are right. And so in a moment, in an hour on a Sunday, in a day, in a space, in a setting, when you or the people you care about show that experience of being safe and supported, rooted and connected, healthy and healing, learning and growing, living with joy and purpose, that is the fullness and richness of the human experience. And that is the experience that, I know it's a duck, I made it so that I wouldn't, that is the experience that we all need. So I would be remiss to not acknowledge the weekend that we are in. And like so many Americans, to pull an MLK quote probably out of context. My understanding of this one is that it was a night after talking to his wife of the possibility, Martin Luther King, of losing his life to the cause. But I was struck by the poignancy of what he had to say, which is the quality, not the longevity of one's life, is what is important. When we think about justice, when we think about well-being, well-becoming, the work is not just that we and those around us should live, but that we and those around us should be fully alive, that we and those around us should have the ability and the right to love this life that we are living. And so what I would encourage you as we end today is to abide in these things that are most important, that matter most to ourselves, to our children, to our families, to our elders, and also as a community and in your professions as you go out this week and in the year to come, that you are called to build the supports and the structures and the systems that can maintain and sustain this for every person who you call a neighbor, who you see as a part of your community and your family. Thank you for having me this morning. It's so wonderful to be with you.
Oh my goodness, that was amazing. Thank you so much for the reminder about how to live our values and really internalize and bring that into our community. I'm so thankful to have you with us today. All right, members of the Welcome Team will now take up a collection to support the Society